All right. Well, I think we are going to get started and welcome anybody who arrives a little late. But our presenter, Edmund Russell from Carnegie Mellon University, is going to limit this to about 30 plus minutes plus some questions. He has a meeting at 4 o'clock, and we don't want to miss it. But I'm very gratified that Ed contacted me with word of this digital map project and its completion. And it struck me that this is certainly the sort of project that, both for the content and the novel ways one can manipulate and reveal patterns and developments by data mapping, as well as the construction of the project. I don't know whether he's going to have time to sort of do both the background to it plus the information. But without further ado, because these are brown bag talks by the Mercurian Special Interest Group of SHOP, the Society for the History of Technology. So I, Alex Magoon, as the chair of Mercurians, will now turn it over without further ado. This is an informal presentation. This is not peer reviewed. This is a collegial gathering, and I look forward to suitable, helpful, and exciting responses afterwards. So you can either put questions or comments in the chat or elsewhere, and we can let Ed respond to those perhaps afterwards. So without further ado, Ed, go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me to present. Thanks to all of you for attending. I thought it would be useful to provide a little bit of background about myself. I know some of you, but not all of you. I'd like to tell you how I arrived at studying telegraphs, and then talk about how I decided to create a digital map. Then I'd like to spend most of the time giving you a tour of the map. So I've been in history of technology since graduate school, but not for the most part, in the communications area. I first studied the environmental history of warfare with a focus on chemical weapons, and then moved into evolutionary history with an emphasis on domestic plants and animals as biotechnologies. And then about 6 years ago, I moved to the University of Kansas and wanted to take up a project on that part of the country. And as it happened, my ancestors were involved with building telegraphs, and I thought that that would be a good project to explore. So that's what I've been doing ever since. And it's high time I get integrated with the Mercurians. It's been on the back of my mind, but it's a delight to be talking to all of you. So my focus in my telegraph research is primarily on what's usually called the transcontinental telegraph, meaning the line that was built across the American West from Missouri to California in 1861. At the time, it was called the Pacific Telegraph, which I think is a better name because it by itself was not a transcontinental line. There was already a regional telegraph system in the East. There was a second regional telegraph system in California. There was no wire connecting the two in 1860. The Pacific Telegraph was designed to link those two regional networks and create a transcontinental system. So transcontinental best applies to the whole system from Atlantic to Pacific Ocean. And the Pacific Telegraph is the term I will use for the line built across the West in 1861. The Pacific Telegraph has been forgotten because it happened to be, for the most part, by historians. There's no book length treatment by historian of the Pacific Telegraph. It's discussed fairly briefly in a number of works, but there hasn't been intensive research into it for quite a while. So the Pacific Telegraph project pioneered the construction model that the transcontinental railroads copied a few years later. The model had multiple companies working simultaneously on different sections of building the Pacific Telegraph. There were 3 companies working on the Pacific Telegraph instead of just 2, but the two that were building the most had one of those companies building from California to Utah, another company building from Nebraska to Utah, and that's where they met. So that's the familiar model that the transcontinental railroads copied, where they also had one building from Nebraska to Utah and another from California to Utah and meeting there. Because there were 2 companies building at the same time, and because they were opening stations along the route as they reached those sites, the status of the line was constantly changing. In writing about the construction process, I wanted to know what the status of both lines was on any given date. But I found that looking that up in a spreadsheet where I recorded those things was tedious and time consuming. And it also did not give me a great picture in my head, a visual image of where the lines were going and what the conditions were for them. So I imagined a digital map with a time slider that would enable me to map the way these 2 telegraph lines were growing toward each other in 1861. So after I collected a lot of hard-won data about opening dates of stations, I decided to build a map. At that point, there's a fork in the decision tree. When one decides to go into digital mapping, one has to decide whether to do the project, do the software for oneself, or hire someone. And I decided to hire a professional cartographer to do the work. I found someone in Pittsburgh named Lauren Winkler. She is a professional digital cartographer, does GIS full-time. Her passion is mapping historical data. She had done some work on infrastructure. For example, she had mapped the bridges in Pittsburgh over time. She had done other historical mapping, for example, recreating the Jewish community in one of the steel mill towns in the Pittsburgh area, Homestead, one of the more famous mill towns in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's kind of a town or a town of towns in many ways, and sometimes it's actually not clear if it's a town or a neighborhood. And I'm not sure whether Homestead is technically a town or a neighborhood, but anyway, she was studying Homestead Hebrews, and that's the name of the map that she and a genealogist produced. So Lauren had not worked on telegraphs, but found the topic interesting and agreed to work with me on it. So we have spent the last 2 years producing a map of the American telegraph system and showing change over time in it. We just released it last week to the public. It's available for free on the Carnegie Mellon University Library website. So I hope that all of you will try it out. Now I'd like to give you a tour. So I will share my screen. When you first land on the site, you will see a splash page. The site is called Uniting the States with Telegraphs, 1844 to 1862. 1844 is the starting date because that was when the first experimental line was built between Baltimore and Washington. 1862 is the ending date because that was the completion of the transcontinental system, including some extra work that had to be done after the Pacific Telegraph was done. And one of well, this page gives you a very brief overview. It emphasizes the importance of new technology for uniting an unusually large nation, which the United States is. And as I dug into this, I was struck by the extent to which Americans in the 19th century believed that telegraphs and steam engines were the key reason that the Pacific region would not split off and become a separate independent republic, though there always was talk about that. So that, in other words, we all know the story of North-South conflict and Southern secession because the South tried to secede. We've largely forgotten about the threat of Western secession because Western areas did not officially try to secede. My overall argument in the book that's going to come out is that the U.S. was doing two things in 1861. It was dividing across its north-south axis in fighting the Confederate rebellion, and at the same time, it was uniting across its east-west axis by building the Pacific Telegraph. So this splash page is an orientation. It provides some instructions about major features to use. A user will close that, and the next thing that one sees is a story panel on the left that gives users an overview of telegraph construction history. I divided it into 5 phases. As users scroll through the story panel, the map automatically reformats to display the phase of construction being described in the panel. So phase 1 was proof of concept, the construction of the line between Washington and Baltimore. In our mapping, all routes between stations are straight lines. The data don't exist over exactly where the lines went in most cases. As I scroll down here on the story panel on the left, you'll see the map automatically reformat. Phase 2 was connecting northeastern cities. Phase 3 was connecting the rest of the East, including the South. Phase 4 was building a separate system in California in the 1850s. And then Phase 5 was connecting those 2 regional systems with the Pacific Telegraph in 1861. So that just provides an overview of the map. We expect users will probably close the story panel at this point and start using the map for themselves. There are 2 key features, and they're both up here at the top. One of them is a time slider, which goes all the way across the top, and the other is a scale controller, the plus and minus symbols here. What I'm going to do is move the time slider all the way back to the left. And this is when 1844, when only this first little line between Washington and Baltimore existed. The time slider works in 1-week increments, and you can see the status of construction. As I move the slider across, you can see the construction. One of the interesting things is that the construction in some cases was discontinuous. I had expected it would start from one point and grow outwards. And generally that was the case, but there were exceptions where discrete segments were first built. And then you'll see the system grow. It's both becoming more extensive in space, especially at first where they're pushing to go far, but then they move to make it more dense. And in the 1850s, you'll see the area, especially around the Great Lakes, get quite dense with telegraphs there. So here we are in the mid-1850s. You can see we have this regional system in the east and this separate system in the west. As I move it along farther, what you're going to see is the appearance of the pony. Well, this is the Overland Mail, the Butterfield Overland Mail. Cameron is the expert on this, so I won't say much more about it. But this is geared to the time slider as well. These are time-sensitive data. And then what you will see in 1860 is another dotted line. This is the Pony Express. One of the things that's been forgotten about the Pony Express is that it was in 2 businesses. One, which we all know about, is that it carried letters, but it also was in the telegraph business. Its job was to ferry telegrams between the westernmost node on the Eastern Telegraph system here in St. Joseph, Missouri, and take it out to the easternmost node on the what's basically the California system, though there's a stub into today's Nevada. And so the Pony Express was a telegraph service as well as a letter service. And what you'll see here, another interesting aspect of the effort to create a Pacific telegraph is that there were two major efforts, one on what was called the central route here, but also another along what was called the southern route, the same route that the Butterfield Mail was using. And there's a line through Missouri here and another line through California. They're both heading south, but the plan is then that they'll turn and follow the mail route and join. So you can see there actually where a lot of the action is. But then in 1860, and then especially in 1861, a lot of the action shifts to the central route. And so now I'm going to click through. What you can see is that the Butterfield Mail was moved in 1861 from the southern route. There was a gap when it wasn't running, and then it started up on the central route. So it'll come back, but it'll be on the central route. And as I get into June, you'll start to see the growth of the Pacific Telegraph, adding stations over here in California, mainly in Nevada territory. You can see that line extending eastward from California. And now there was some just in Nebraska too, it's growing there. More out in Nevada, they continue growing through to meet each other. And then in October of 1861, they connect and create a transcontinental system. First, the line from the east finished first, but there's a gap over here in today's Utah and Nevada. But a week later, that gap was filled, and now we have a transcontinental telegraph system. And that's when the Pony Express went out of business because it was no longer needed to carry telegrams. So, and also there are other kind of complicated reasons. The map enables users to put the history of telegraphs into their context in various ways. One of them is the political context. At the same time that telegraphs were being built, the state and territories, especially in the West, were being changed. The boundaries were being changed. So these, and now I'm just displaying, I took away the telegraph information. I'm just showing states and territories. These are time sensitive data too. So the time slider controls the display so that you're seeing accurate boundaries as of a given date. So as I move the time slider, you'll see, for example, Texas come in as a state, Iowa comes in as a state, Minnesota comes in, and now what I'm into 1850, what you're going to see is the territory boundaries are changing, being revised. This, and it'll go on actually continuously all the way through. So it's a period of rapid political change. And this is a good example of why I wanted to have a digital map, because it would enable me to keep track of multiple variables that were constantly changing. Not only were telegraph lines growing, but political boundaries were growing. There was no way I could remember what all the boundaries were on any given date, along with which stations were open and that sort of thing. So by putting them into a map like this, I was able to store it all together and see how they went along. In this particular view now, we're in 1862, and these crosshatched states are the ones in the Confederacy. So that's the layer that shows political boundaries. There are other boundaries as well. As you look over here on the lower right, we have this control box labeled layers, and you can turn on and turn off the telegraph lines. Earlier, I was showing lines. Now let me show you about stations. So the stations each have well, I'll turn the line back on. So it makes more sense then. A dot, a circle represents a station. If you hover over that station, the pop-up will tell you the name of that place, the name of the company that built that built an office there for the first time, and the date that that particular office opened. These were very hard data to come by, enormously time intensive. A lot of research in historic newspapers to figure out when individual offices opened. If anybody created year-by-year lists of telegraph stations throughout the country between 1844 and 1862, we could not find them. So a lot of this was just, laborious work in individual newspapers to find out when an office opened. Where you see numbers with numerals within the circle, that means there are multiple companies with offices in that city. Pittsburgh, for example, in 1861 had 5 companies. If I click on it, the circle expands into what's called a spider, a structure with smaller circles like little pod feet out here. And these tell you the same kind of information I showed you for that single station. It tells you the town, the name of the telegraph company, and when it opened. So in Pittsburgh in 1861, there was the Cleveland, Warren, and Pittsburgh Telegraph. Here's a second one, here's a third one, here's a fourth one, here's a fifth one. If you click on them for any given station, an information panel opens up on the left that tells you about that information. It repeats some of the information you got by hovering over or clicking on the circle. It tells you the name of the company, the opening date, but it also adds our source, our sources of information. This is a scholarly product, and so we have cited the source for all of the information in the map. So that's here. In some cases, we have tracked down the original address of the offices. For most stations, we have them located we know they're in a city, but in most cases, we haven't had the time to figure out addresses, but in some cases we have. Pittsburgh's of particular interest because Lauren and I both live in Pittsburgh. And what we found is that the original telegraph station was at 98 4th Street. Pittsburgh renumbered its streets at some point. So today it's at 314 4th Avenue. Which today has a bank building on that location. But the very first office is shown right here in this image. If I click on it, it expands so you get a bigger view. This is what the very first telegraph office in Pittsburgh looked like. And there are, on this arrow, I can click and show you more things. This is the newspaper article telling people how excited they are to get the first telegraph. On December 30th, 1846, the newspapers presenting the first dispatches. Dispatch was the standard term for what later people called telegrams. So if you read dispatch, that means telegram. And they're excited because it's news from the lightning line from the east. Lightning was a synonym for electricity as well as a description of speed. And they emphasize the speed, the marvelous facility with which news is conveyed on this great invention of the age, a source of admiration to people who crowded the telegraph office during the afternoon and evening. We shall spare neither pains nor expense to put our readers in possession of the latest intelligence. This news is now emphatically received by lightning and printed by steam. So it brings you back to those two key technologies for uniting a vast nation rather. And we don't think as much about steam as today, at least I don't, as powering printing presses, but they were very important as machines to power printing presses as well as boats, ships, and railroads and factories. Then we have another image here. This is an image from the city directory of Pittsburgh in 1850. And this is an example of how we know the address for a telegraph station. So this is showing that this particular telegraph company had its office in number 100 4th Street. You might remember that the first office was 98 4th Street. This is typical because telegraph lines serve different regions. Messages, telegrams, had to often cross the lines of multiple companies. And early on, there were no mechanical repeaters, no mechanical devices for copying messages from one company's system or of wires to the next. So operators had to write down the message on a piece of paper, hand it to the operator for the next company. What that meant was that the companies tended to put their offices as close together as possible in the business district. The business, the primary users of telegraphs were business people and newspapers. So in reading that article and showing you how excited the newspaper was, that's exemplifies the degree to which newspapers were thrilled by this new speedy communication technology. And this location was in the financial district then, and in the financial district, the buildings from the 20th century financial district are there. Some of them have moved to other buildings, and some of the buildings have been repurposed, but it's still basically a financial center. So what you can see, going back to Pittsburgh, you can see that the lines coming to Pittsburgh have different colors. Each color represents a different company. So you can see why they needed to have offices near each other to share messages. So this feature, the pair of features, the time slider and the scale controller, enable the user to see a lot of what they might want to see. We can even go in closer in Pittsburgh and switch from this historic base map to a current map. And this is a map of Pittsburgh's streets today. So this is where it's located now. There are other options. You could look at it in terms of topography like this, and you can even look at it in terms of satellite imagery for today. So those are some layers. Those of you who have worked with software known as Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, know that the ability to create maps with multiple layers is one of the chief attractions of the software. In this case, we've got layers that show a variety of types of data that provide the context for it. In addition to things like topography, we have things like Native American land title status. So I'm going to turn off the Pony Express and the mail, just have the lines. Okay, now I'm going to move the time slider back. The light areas in the map are the areas where natives have lost a title to the land. The dark areas are areas where natives still hold title to the land. What you'll see as the telegraphs are built in the east is that they're built on lands to which natives do not hold title. Now switch your eyes to California, and you'll see that title's lost, and then pretty quickly after, the telegraph line is built in California. Now, we're moving to the 1850s, which is a period of rapid change and a lot of conflict in the West. And what you're going to see is the line races into in Nebraska, in the center of the country. There's a treaty, and the line goes, sort of right after. But then the Pacific Telegraph ends up being on native land. And this became a source of conflict between natives and the telegraph companies and the United States government. In addition, we have some historic maps. There are surprisingly few maps that have survived of telegraph systems. So we've included some of the few that exist. The best one is this 1853 map, which I clicked on in the control layer box. And it shows a map of telegraph system in 1853. This was our single best source of data. We knew that these stations were opened by this particular date. And what you can see is our lines are here, and they're similar to the mapping of the lines on this old 1853 map, but they're not identical. And the reason is that this historic map is not intended to be precisely accurate geographically. It's intended to be accurate to show you which stations are open and the routes that telegrams take to get to those stations. It's like schematized subway maps, which simplify the routes and pretend that the subway in DC, for example, goes in straight lines when actually it's curving and that sort of thing. So this map is interesting. We've cut off a feature that is on the original map. On the left, it would be right here. It's not there because it's a list of prices. This map shows the price to send a telegram from Pittsburgh to any station in the United States in 1853. And it's gold. It's the only map of this type that I have found. I suspect that this was created to display on the wall of the telegraph office. This way, somebody could walk into the office in Pittsburgh, see whether the town where they wanted to send a telegram had an office, and if so, how much it would cost them to send their telegram. Telegrams were priced by distance and word. The pricing was X amount for the first 10 words, and then Y amount for each additional word. And if it went a short distance, it was cheaper. If it went a longer distance, it was more expensive. But this overlaying this gives you a sense of how, when you were standing in Pittsburgh, thinking about where your message would go, you wouldn't actually see all these different company names. Our overlay shows in colors that your messages went on a lot of companies, but for people at the time, all they saw was black lines. So they didn't know that these were different companies, but it worked. The companies shared the tariff between them. So those are some of the features of the map. There are others, but I think that's enough to give you a good sense of the kind of things that are here so far. This is not a finished product. We have our mapping of stations is representative but not exhaustive. So we can add more stations, but are also thinking about additional layers that would be interesting. And I'm thinking about multiple kinds of users. I'm working with a teacher to develop a module for K-12 teachers, so they would get advice on how to use this in the classroom. So that's about half an hour. So I think this is a good place to stop my presentation and field your questions and comments and suggestions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Ed. This is a really remarkable, more than a labor of love, but a wonderful combination of love and a lot of effort and thought on your part. And I gather, did you use your students to do some of the research for all these little telegraph stations?
Lauren and I did all of the research. So initially I had a large amount of research done before I approached her, because I wanted to have data ready to map before I found a cartographer. So I had organized the data in a spreadsheet, and so I had a lot of that, and I handed that to her. When I hired her, I envisioned a clean division of labor. I thought I would provide the data and Lauren would map it. But Lauren got interested in telegraph history and started researching stations as well. And so she generated data on stations and their opening dates as well. But all of the data comes from the research that the two of us did.
I, for one, would like to congratulate you on a really extraordinary achievement. I've looked at many of the early maps, and being able to trace the evolution and the movement of those lines is just fantastic. I wonder if you've been in touch with the Morse Telegraph Club. They would just love this material. A lot of their members trace back to the early telegraph, and their interest goes back into early telegraph, and I think they'd be fascinated, as would all of the telegraph historians that I know. Bill Burns particularly has worked on maps of submarine telegraph cables, and I wonder what his thoughts are on this. He's up until I met you, and delighted to see your work. I was relying on Bill as sort of being the map guy.
There's room for many map guys. Thank you very much. Those are kind comments. I appreciate the recommendation of audiences that might find this. If you were able to drop me a line with contact information, I would be very grateful.
We can certainly arrange that. I guess my question, if Bill wants to pop in here, but I'm thinking he has just that amazing website, which is far more than the Atlantic cable. But I kind of wonder, could you link up your mapping to, say, Bill's collection of, I understand by 1862 there's not much underwater cabling, but just to begin to think sort of ambitiously about what happens if you went to, I don't know, 1914 and began to do a global, take the data of all these other scholars and historians and began to connect the dots, as it were.
I would love to collaborate with others and create a global map. That's my grandiose dream, and I think it would best be done in a collaborative way, where specialists in different parts of the globe took charge of it. I see in the chat that Bill Burns says he has no microphone, so unfortunately, it sounds like we can't hear from him today, which I'm really disappointed about. Bill, I'd like to send an invitation for us to talk at some point when we could have microphones and share information. Alex, you raised both essentially a process question and a substantive question. The process question was, can this map be linked to other maps of other places? And I am not the technical person, but I have to believe that the answer is yes, and I certainly hope that that's what can be done. On the question about cables, there was an Atlantic cable laid in 1858 that worked very briefly. It failed almost immediately. It was greeted with enormous ballyhoo, huge celebrations all the way across the continent. Sacramento had a big Atlantic cable celebration with a big parade, even though they weren't connected to it, but they knew. Actually, at that time, they expected but didn't know. They hoped that the Pacific Telegraph would be built soon, but didn't have it. But that failed quickly, and that was happening around the world with long undersea cables. The failure, most of them were failing, and so
that's not actually true. Sorry, I've hooked up my microphone now.
But in 1858.
1858, the Atlantic cable was the first very long cable. Before that, the longest cables were a couple of 100 miles. And the cables between Britain and Ireland, Britain and the continent were all working. And there was quite an extensive commercial network of cables connecting the landline systems at that point. You're right that the 1858 Atlantic cable failed after a few weeks for various reasons. And it wasn't until 1866 that they established a permanent route.
Right.
But after that, it was just boom time.
It was, so I'm zeroing in on this period when the Pacific Telegraph was built in 1861, because there was so much doubt about long undersea cables. Yes, short ones were working just fine, but the long ones were having a lot of problems. So the Western Union, which oversaw the construction of the Pacific Telegraph, thought the best bet was to build a global telegraph system staying on land as much as possible. So that meant continuing the Pacific Telegraph up the west coast to Alaska, across the Bering Strait, where you only needed a short cable, over to Russia and across Russia to all the way to London. So
Yeah,
that was
just 5,000 miles for that last leg.
yeah. So well, and Russia was building towards the Pacific at the time. So
That's correct,
so
yeah.
that it's in the end that 1866 undersea cable under the Atlantic is laid and works, which halted the construction of this Russian line, well, the Bering Strait line, but they were building it in 1866 when the successful Atlantic cable was laid. So this, Alex, what I'm trying to address is a question about the global context. This landline across the West, the Pacific Telegraph, was seen as the centerpiece, the down payment on the global system at that time.
Aaron Menden Plasic has some questions. Go ahead, Aaron, if you unmute yourself.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So I've really enjoyed your talk and seeing the project. It's very exciting. I just have a few questions that I think I would love to hear your answer to. So the first question is about funding. Like, where did you get funding from this project? Like, was it a bunch of small grants? Was it a huge grant? Were there no grants? Do you just fund it out of your own pocket? The second thing is, how will the project live on? I'll be so sad, right? When, like, you know, technology changes slightly, you know, the web changes slightly, and then like many of these things won't work in the same way. They may still work, right? But it'll be problematic, right? And so I'm curious to know how you're thinking about keeping this alive in the future, because it'd be so sad to see it go away. And then the third thing, which is more historical, sorry, I'm visiting my sister-in-laws and I think my niece is playing with the doorbell. But in any case, the third question, more historical, what's like an insight that you came to as a consequence of making these maps? Right, so it's like an insight that you arrived at because you were in the process of making this digital map that's able to be manipulated. So those are the questions. Thank you very much. Really appreciated the talk.
Those are three great questions. One of them, I don't remember the order, but one of them is durability. That's a really important issue. Digital humanities is terrible in general at durability. People get grants to create websites. They create the websites, they put them up, and then they don't have grants to maintain them. And you're right, the software changes around them. The sites become inaccessible, and that's the end of the project. So digital humanities in general has a major problem with durability. The way I addressed that was that I talked to my university library and told them that, well, asked them if they'd be willing to host it. And my pitch was, libraries have been in the business of protecting and making accessible information for a long time. And this is one of the new ways of disseminating information. And I was looking for a place that would make a long-term commitment to keeping the software current so that it is accessible indefinitely. And so I was thrilled that the Carnegie Mellon Library agreed to host it. And that came with a second advantage. They have a web developer named Jonathan Kirathan, who came in towards the end of the project and helped really Lauren, because I don't really do any of the technical part, adapt what she had developed in ArcGIS, that's the software she had used, and some other packages, and get it ready to go on the web and work across multiple browsers and that kind of thing. So I'm really thrilled to have a library as the host for that reason. So that was one question. Funding. I am fortunate in that I have an endowed chair at Carnegie Mellon that comes with a research account, and I use that money to pay Lauren for her work. So I didn't have to, I'm glad that I didn't have to write a bunch of grants and try to cobble together small amounts of money. It was much more efficient use of my time to just be able to focus on the research and the design of the map instead of writing grant proposals. So that's where the money came from, but it's not cheap. It's not cheap. So that's a significant barrier to digital scholarship. Hiring next, if I'd learned the software, it would have been cheaper, but that would have been a suboptimal use of my time. And I was lucky to get a pro to do it. So that was those were two questions. Oh, what did I learn from it? Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, some of the things like the status of native land title is a really good example of what I was able to learn because I created this map. The ability, I mean, I thought I suspected all that, but having it displayed there really went a long way in helping me see how it worked. Another thing that I learned, and this is not going to be in the Pacific Telegraph book, but the discontinuous construction in the East in the beginning was interesting to me, partly because when I learned in my research that the Pony Express was a telegraph service, which had been forgotten, what I realized is that it was a temporary link in the telegraph, in an incomplete telegraph system, that the telegraph system was still under construction. There were these two regional systems. There was demand for a biotechnology to ferry messages between the electrical parts of this broader system. And then I thought, well, if I'm right about that in the West, there should have been Pony Expresses in the East that did the same thing during construction. And the answer is yes, that there were Pony Expresses who ferried telegrams across gaps in the telegraph system. So that's later in my queue of books to write, but this is, it's really a combination of the map and my documentary research. I'm going to tell a very different story about the Pony Express than the standard story, which is the standard story is it's a pre-modern mail service. And in fact, I will argue that it was a highly modern telegraph service. It wasn't a throwback to the rugged individualist cowboys, which didn't even exist. It was part of the telegraph system, and the symbol at the time were jockeys. They weren't cowboys. The logos that were used were jockeys. So the people wanted it to be seen as fast. Not the speed was the key thing, not the rugged individualism.
If I may jump back in, I know we're coming up. Ed has a meeting at 4, so we don't want to keep him too long. But it's just occurring to me that we've been sort of projecting forward. Take this to the expansion of the cable telegraph systems nationally and regionally and internationally. And I'm also thinking you could do it backwards, because optical telegraphy, the stereotype is that it was only Claude Chappé and the French and a little bit of the English doing the Admiralty. And I don't know, I've ended up poking about this, and there was an astonishing amount of, the so-called telegraph hills in San Francisco, but along the port systems of at least the Atlantic Northeast of the United States had a variety of these optical systems in operation, along with far more than Portsmouth to London in England. And I'm thinking, conceivably, you could begin to say, well, yes, cable telegraphy begins with Morse and a number of other individuals in the 1830s, but they're overlapping and hybridizing with the optical telegraph people before them as well.
Yeah, we would expect that. I haven't found that in my research, but that would be logical to combine those. I mean, one of the things that I did really come to appreciate was the heterogeneous nature of these communication systems. They were cobbled together, and it took decades to build the national system. So other types of technologies were incorporated as links. Yeah, but you know, I've done some research on the 1840s, but not the in-depth that I've done about the later period. But that's a great hypothesis. I will certainly look to see if optical telegraphs were used as links in this or in that kind of thing.
Yeah, this was again the beauty of Google Books doing 19th century searching, and I've forgotten what got me started, but you found these fascinating accounts, and I think this was more the 1830s, maybe 1820s, of the people cursing and, you know, regretting the frustrations of not so much the optical, but even stringing those cables across farmland. There were a lot of very suspicious farm landowners about what this electrical wire is going to do to their cattle or their crops.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
whole side.
Yeah. I see Marianne has a question in the chat. What did your research? Did your research reveal new information about the relationship between the expansion of the telegraph and railroads? Yeah, that's a good question. And many of you probably have seen Schwantis's recent book about that relationship, and I'll recommend that to everybody interested in this. Mainly the thing I found is the telegraphs began after the railroads and soon outpaced the railroads. And Schwantes makes the point that railroads did not adopt telegraphs as fast as Chandler and others had suggested. But across the West, that was all built before railroads. So the railroad was following the telegraph rather than vice versa. I want to add a layer. I've just found some good maps of railroad systems. So that's a planned layer to add to the map. I have some great maps from 1861. I'm hoping to find ones that are time. I'm hoping somebody has already done the research to create a digital version, an analog to what I've done, but for railroads. That would be ideal.
Well,
I see Michael Fagan has a question.
Go, Michael. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Ed. Yeah, this map that you and Lauren made is fantastic. It's an excellent work. I wanted to sort of jump off of sort of conversations we've been having about like the futures of the project and where you would be interested in expanding it in the future. You just mentioned railroads. Some people have mentioned cables, as well as international connections. I was actually thrilled to see that this project included the telegraph companies and lines and stations of the Canadian colonies at this time. I was thrilled because the one thing I was expecting was that it just sort of dead ended at the border. So it was fantastic to see these lines and Canadian companies as well recognized and expanding into even parts of eventually the United States. So one of the things I was wondering, you had mentioned sort of in the article where you interviewed with Carnegie Mellon that one of the sort of motivators of this was to try and disentangle a lot of the confusing, hard to visualize, hard to conceptualize information of early telegraphy. And I agree, finding accurate and consistent and understandable information about the early telegraph system pre-Civil War is quite difficult. One of the other suggestions I think for a future expansion could be in a sort of scramble of corporate telegraph acquisitions and mergers of the late 19th century, because those are, I mean, I've been going through those a lot myself, and those are brain-bustingly complex, and as you said with the early telegraphy, hard to visualize and compare with each other.
Yeah, that is an ambition. In the U.S., the consolidation really started going strong in the 1850s, and so this map shows the companies that first built the lines, but it actually is not accurate going forward as to who owned the line later in all cases, because other companies would have taken them over. Western Union was basically build its strategy by buying other lines. We haven't tried to tackle that, but yeah, it'd be really complicated, and it's complicated because also not only what do you do with a line that's leased?
Exactly.
Do you show that as owned by the company that owns it or the company that has leased it? And
Blend
if you've already figured out all the data and want to hand it over, we'd be thrilled to map it. But yes, to show the consolidation is a key part of the story that would be good to have, but is not here at the moment.
Yeah. I'm most familiar with from the Canadian lines and angles. The American one is far more complicated. But thank you so much for answering these questions.
Marianne asked about defunct lines, Ed.
Yeah, some lines did go out of business. I'll show you one interesting defunct line. Okay, so I'm going to take us right down into the Washington, D.C. area. And I'm going to move the time slider over here. And we'll go forward in time. Boop, 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 boop. What? Oh, yeah, I wasn't, the scale was wrong. There. See between Washington and Alexandria? See how there's a line there? And now there's not. That's 1862. That's the American Civil War. Washington was capital of the United States, and Virginia, which is right here, was the capital of the Confederacy. And
so we don't even want to think about the military telegraph lines during the conflict itself.
Yeah, and those are getting underway when we in the map.
Right.
And
what's interesting though is that's not even that doesn't get cut right when the Civil War begins. It's much a little later.
It is. Yeah. At first they. Yeah, it's its own complicated and interesting story, and we haven't tried to take that on. That would be another really interesting thing for somebody to take on.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. I really appreciate all that you and Lauren and your team colleagues have done at Carnegie Mellon and to produce this and to share this with us in particular. This has been recorded. I will try to get it downloaded and maybe edit out the waiting period beforehand, but it will go up on Engineering History, and I will share a link, at least with those of you that I know how to get in touch with or through Google Groups. So without further ado, thank you very much. If you're interested in Mercurians communications technology history, please sign up for the Mercurians Google group. There is a permission, but I'm happy to give it. And look forward to seeing you next time, which we think maybe Tom Pereira and how they really made Enigma machinery at a date to be determined. So thank you very much and farewell.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you again, Edmund. I'm going to be away for a month, so
okay,
we'll work it out a little later in the summer.
That's fine.
Sounds good. Bye, y'all.
Thank you
Bye,
so much.
Ed.
Bill, you need an extra camera? I have one. I'll send it to you. Or a microphone.
Oh, dear.
Okay. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.